Call to order the City of Lake Forest District 67 Board of Education meeting for January 27th, 2015. Could I have a roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Folker?
Here.
Mr. Lemke?
Here.
Mrs. Clemenson? Here. Mr. Anderson?
Present.
Mrs. Fisher? Here. Mr. Schuler? Absent, sorry. Mr. Borkowski?
Here.
We have a quorum.
The first item on the agenda, or good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. The first item on the agenda is the President's report. Educational, business, governmental, and nonprofit organizations may have significantly different goals and objectives, but organizationally they face many of the same challenges. The issues that these types of organizations confront often overlap because all of them face the significant challenge of orchestrating and motivating a large group of people toward a common objective. This was highlighted last month when Roman Catholic Pope Francis gave his annual year-end address to the group of cardinals who served with him in the Vatican. Usually in this address, the Pope offers spiritual guidance to the cardinals and members of the Catholic Church around the world. This year, however, was different. With the Pope having been on the job for 2 years and having seen some things which greatly bothered him, he used the address to offer unusually blunt criticism of the workings of the Vatican bureaucracy. To be specific, he listed 15 problem areas in which he believed those who worked at the Vatican had lost touch with the mission of the Church. Some of the criticisms, such as existential schizophrenia and spiritual Alzheimer's, were specific to the workings of a religious organization. But other issues cited by Pope Francis would be familiar to most CEOs, board members, executives, or anyone tasked with managing or overseeing a large organization. I'd recommend a speech to anyone who's interested. One of the concerns expressed in the speech relates to the important subject of planning. This is a topic of interest to the board as the district works to implement a strategic plan in keeping with the mission, vision, and goals work undertaken by the board and district last year. In his speech, Francis points out that preparing things well is necessary, but he warns against, and I'm paraphrasing and interpreting, falling into the temptation to believe we can accurately foresee every opportunity, every circumstance, new development, or problem that might come along. To believe that this is possible is to underestimate both the complexity of the world and the creativity and initiative of the people inside and outside an organization. A vision should focus on broad, long-term goals for an organization. The specific plan to achieve those objectives must be determined and bought into by those charged with implementing the plan, or it is unlikely to succeed. A plan should never be so rigid or inflexible or take so much time to monitor or document that it inhibits rather than facilitates the achievement of the very goals the organization is set on accomplishing. Another concern expressed in Pope Francis' speech was about having what he called a funereal face, by which he meant people taking themselves too seriously. This is also a potential issue in the education world, including for school board members, because we all believe education is so important, and we take it very seriously. While this is great, we must keep in mind that it's the educational mission of the district, not us personally, which is of paramount importance, and not fall into the trap of confusing the two. Francis warns about theatrical severity and sterile pessimism, and suggests instead that people should be polite, serene, enthusiastic, happy, and transmit joy wherever they go. Serving on this board is an important responsibility, but it's also a privilege, and in its own way, an opportunity to bring some level of joy, or at least positive feelings, to the community. If we set a good example through the way we interact with administrators, the community, and each other, if we work together in a respectful, enthusiastic, and productive manner, it makes a meaningful difference in creating the learning and working environment which all of our constituencies hope for. If we don't, just the opposite can be the case. For all the issues we focus on as a board, we should always remember that we play a vital role in determining the overall environment of the district, and that this is one of our most important jobs. That concludes the President's report. The next item on the agenda is the Superintendent's report. Mr. Simic.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. The Community Wellness Task Force of Lake Forest and Lake Bluff is hosting a parent forum on Thursday, February 12th from 7 to 8 at the Lake Forest Hospital Health and Fitness Center. The board members have a flyer from that at their table. Dr. Reinecke, widely agreed to be a very engaging presenter, will be the featured speaker, and I'd like to encourage each of you to attend. And I'd also like to extend our appreciation to Dr. Ingrid Weimer for her participation in the task force and leadership. One of the things that we heard loud and clear in the Mission Vision Goals process is the importance of maintaining, keeping our eye on the ball in terms of social and emotional wellness for our students, so that work continues. It's also been a very busy month for Mission Vision Goals work as the strategic plan has gone online and the build-out of the metrics has begun. Mrs. Whipple and I have been making the rounds, discussing the strategic plan and the work of the district. To date, we've spoken to the APT liaison and APT Deer Path APT and APT presidents. Deer Path East and West have been hard at work on their schedule proposal, which they had hoped would be ready for tonight's meeting. And as so often is the case, the devil is in the details, and they continue to hammer out critical issues. Schedules are much like family or organizational budgets as they delineate priorities and values. Some of the questions at issue for the schedule are the degree to which all students should have access to all exploratory classes in middle school, and also the trade-off of core class time and elective class time. Stay tuned on that. The build-up to Dr. Carol Dweck's presentation was featured in the district newsletter this past week, sent to all homes in the 3 districts. Dr. Dweck will speak to the public later this year on August 21st, and until then, Mrs. Whipple will have me on another tour of our publicly elected officials, including City Council, Village Board, and many other groups, encouraging their participation in the community book read. I've already spoken with the Graduate School of Management leader, the head of the college, and also the city manager. I speak with a wide range of other folks. One of the things that is a challenge put down by one of our yet-to-be elected school board members. I asked to meet with me about a month and a half ago and said, okay, so if I want to get a head start, what should I do? And I said, well, you should read the book Mindset. And a few weeks later, I talked to him. He said, I'm really excited about the book. He said, you know, I've read it. He said, wow, what'd you think? I've given 80 copies of it away already. And so that's one of the things that we certainly hope to do. So he's encouraged the people that he's working with. You'll all get a copy. Watch out, here it comes. And then we'll do tallies on how many you've passed out, right? So he's very excited about the work. The book Mindset is really typical, is really representative of what we're trying to achieve across the district, and will extend our work. So I look forward to reporting more about that in the future months to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simic, and we look forward to meeting the new board members, and everyone likes a teacher's pet. The next item on the agenda is public participation. Are there any members of the public who would like to address the board on any matter of their choosing? Seeing none, we come to reports and discussions. Mr. Simic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. We have no reports or discussions for tonight's meeting.
Thank you very much. We now come to board committees. The first is the Board Education Committee, chaired by Leslie Fisher. Ms. Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. The Education Committee has not met in the previous month. We will be meeting Thursday, February 19th at 8:15 a.m. right here at West Campus. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is the Board Finance and Operations Committee. Mr. Schuler is absent this evening. Would either Mr. Lemke or Mr. Borkowski like to make a report? Thank you very much. We now move to the Policy Committee. Mr. Borkowski.
Board Policy Committee met on January 15th. We first covered a number of press policy updates and recommendations from the IASB and state legislature. The items that the committee felt appropriate for our district will be voted on later tonight. We then began a review of the district's social media policies. Certain portions of that will undergo additional review, and a discussion in the near future will occur on that. We also discussed a conflict in the current board policies regarding the board's role in curriculum adoption. Jeff and Lauren will be investigating this further, and the policy committee will consider how to best clarify this at our next meeting. The last item we discussed involved the board the board's committee structure, and how we ensure compliance with the Open Meetings Act. I reviewed with the policy committee, and I want to quickly review with the board now a conference call that I had with the board's legal counsel and OMA expert Brian Crowley, and Mike Semick was on that call as well. On that call, we discussed that while all board committees consist of 2 or 3 board members, sometimes additional board members attend committee meetings as members of the public because they are interested in the topic being discussed. We all view this as a good thing, as we want informed and engaged board members. We discussed that board members do have the right to attend these meetings as member of the public, but we need to ensure this is done in a way that complies fully with OMA. To this end, all members of the public should be treated consistently, and they should only participate during public participation times as shown on the agenda. Each committee chair is permitted to establish rules for public participation at his or her committee meetings, and these rules should be applied consistently. Establishing multiple times for public participation during a committee meeting, for example, at the beginning and at the end of a meeting or after certain topics have been covered, is permitted and is compliant with OMA. These public participation times simply need to be administered in a consistent basis for all public. If any committee chair or board member would like more details on this topic, I'm happy to provide it. There's no change to our policy regarding committee structure. I'm simply sharing this information so that we all implement the policies appropriately. That concludes the policy committee report.
Thank you, Mr. Burkowski. Next is the Compensation Committee, Rob Lemke.
The Compensation Committee has not met.
Thank you very much. We can now come to liaison reports. First is the North Suburban Special Education District, Mike Burkowski.
The NSSED board met on January 14th. The only significant topic discussed at that meeting that the District 67 board may not be aware of is the continued work being done to meld the executive committee into the governing board. This is being done to improve transparency for all member districts. I expect this to formally occur later this spring. 2 other meetings have occurred. A tri-district board workshop was held on January 22nd to review the current usage of NSSED by our district 115 and 65. Most of my fellow board members were in attendance at that meeting. Lastly, on January 23rd, a quad district meeting was held with District 67, 115, 65, and NSSED. At this meeting, discussions took place on some of the more important desired state issues that our district has defined for NSSED. No major breakthroughs occurred at that meeting, but I believe the open, honest, and direct dialogue was a positive step for all involved. That concludes the NSSED report.
Thank you very much. Next is Illinois Association of School Boards, EdRed. And I'd just like to update board members on the status of the pension reform bill, which was passed earlier this year. And as you know, there were a number of lawsuits that came out of that that challenged that law. And in November, the law was found to be unconstitutional in the lower court. The state then appealed the case to the Illinois Supreme Court, which has agreed to hear it on an expedited basis, I believe in March. So sometime after that, there will be a final decision on the state of the pension reform bill. I think most people expect that it will be found unconstitutional and that the lower court ruling will be upheld. That concludes report on EdRed. Next is Curriculum Coordinating Committee, Leslie Fisher.
Thank you. The Curriculum Coordinating Committee has not met in the past month. We will be meeting Thursday, February 5th at 4 p.m. here at West Campus.
Thank you, Leslie. Next, Spirit of 67.
The Spirit of 67 board meeting was held here at West Campus on January 13th. And Mr. Simic, in his superintendent report, addressed school closing determination and the fact that the administration is in the process of reviewing and re-evaluating the process. Determining factors include things that most of us might not think about on a regular basis when we have dangerously low temperatures. There are evacuation sites at least 2 of our elementary schools that are a fair distance from where our schools are. For instance, at Everett School, the evacuation site is the fire department. And at Cherokee School, Where is the evacuation site at Cherokee School?
Country Day.
Country Day. So being familiar with the area, you understand that especially when dealing with younger children, in order, if there were some type of emergency where they needed to leave the building on a short notice, between bundling the children up, having to walk a distance, having to wait outside for a certain period of time, just might not be a safe decision to make. And Mr. Simic really emphasized that the district would always err on the side of safety for our children. While discussing that, we also discussed the idea of certain days off, including Martin Luther King Day and President's Day, and how do we make up days. As in the situation we got ourselves into last year with the cold days, we needed to then make up further days in June, which a lot of people do not think is of value or to our students, and it's certainly not of convenience to our families. So one of the things that the group came up with was, first of all, it's certainly too late at this point this year to be making a change. The calendar says what the calendar says, and we know that because we vote on it on an annual basis. And there is a caveat at the bottom of the calendar that does say there may be snow days, weather days that will take us into these certain days in June, and we certainly only have 2 days added on at this point. But we did discuss the opportunity that when we look at the calendar again, when we revisit the calendar again, well, when you revisit the calendar again, you will take into consideration a couple of things. One of them being the notion to perhaps consider attendance for Martin Luther King Day and use it as an opportunity for enrichment and for understanding of what the holiday is truly about, as opposed to giving it as a free day. The other thing would be to take a look at Lake Bluff's calendar that they use. They do have a note on their calendar that if certain weather, I don't know exactly the verbiage, but if certain weather occurs, days from President's Day may be used to make up some of that time. It's a nice option to have, so maybe to look at the Lake Bluff calendar. The treasurer reported that 492 families currently are members of the Spirit, so that's 42% of our district families are participating. We would like it to be bigger. And when we say that a family is a member, there is not a minimum donation, and I think people need to be clear on that. You just need to participate. There's not a minimum donation to be a participating member, and all students, District 67 students, benefit from the Spirit every day. Important upcoming date, Spirit Family Game Night is being held in the DPM cafeteria this Friday night, January 30th, from 5 to 7 p.m. Some of the teachers will even be there playing math games, and kids will leave with games. A lot of them will leave with games to take home, play at home as well. Our next meeting is February 10th at 9:15 in this room right here. Thank you very much. Oh, no, I wanted to add one thing. The Grants Committee met for the first time today, and I was there with Kathy Guyvenjack, who's here in our audience today. It is one of my favorite parts of my role as Spirit Board Liaison we spend about, there's a group of about 12, 15 of us who spend 3 hours at least twice a week for about 6 weeks hearing about all of the grants that not only teachers have applied for, but that community members and this year students have applied for. We review the grants, and I'm happy to say we've received an estimated 30 grants, and that we are being asked to donate as the Spirit over $200,000 in those grants. So we'll be determining the grants and what will be approved in the upcoming weeks and months. So really looking forward to that process. That concludes my report.
Thank you, Ms. Fisher. Next is APT, Leslie Fisher.
And for January, we were very fortunate that Jeff Folker sat in with the executive APT board. Jeff.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. I had the distinct pleasure of representing the school board at the January APT Executive Board meeting that was held on Wednesday, January 14th. My role during the meeting was not only to give the board an update of key school board initiatives, but to provide them with an overview of the policy committee. Yes, the policy committee. Its purpose, its role, and some of the specific things we're working on. I am happy to report that no one fell asleep during this portion of the meeting. As far as I know, right? As usual, there are a lot of things going on with the APT, so I'll just touch on some highlights. As Mr. Simic pointed out, he met with the APT Exec Board to share a review of the district strategic plan, as well as some of our key strategic initiatives in the areas of achievement, instruction, and assessment. This information was well received and appreciated. He also provided insight regarding the decision-making process for canceling school due to cold weather or snow. This was not as well received. No, I'm just kidding. It was fine. Mrs. Whipple attended as well to provide information regarding the school climate survey and to ask for the APT's help in getting the surveys completed. She also reported on our recent approval of online registration for next school year. The big happenings right now at the APT Exec Board level are the Nominations Committee has had its first meeting and is now in the process of selecting potential candidates for the following positions: APT Exec Board President, APT Exec Board Treasurer, APT Exec Board Secretary, DPM Building President, and the Everett Building President. The committee will announce their slate of candidates at the February Exec Board meeting, and elections will be held at the March district-wide APT meeting. All these positions are for the 2015 through 2017 school years, and the process is being led by current Everett Building President Umang Singh. The Fine Arts Committee discussed the upcoming, or now recent, performance of the Sukata Taiko Drummers. And they were at the elementary schools on January 20th and the 21st, and according to my son, they were awesome. Cherokee, Everett, and Sheridan APTs combined to have a joint APT meeting back on January 21st in the DPM Cube. Their special guest speaker was Emily Correa, our District 67 Wellness Coordinator. This was the first time they had tried a joint meeting like this, and the initial response was positive, and I understand the attendance was excellent. But at the moment, there's no immediate plans to do that again, since there is already a district-wide joint meeting in March. But Cherokee had its Winterfest this past Friday night, and again, according to my son, it was awesome. Everett is planning their Winter Space Jam on Friday, February 6th, and will feature a presentation from the Adler Planetarium, which sounds nice, as well as dancers and a DJ. My son will not be in attendance for that event, but I'm sure it will be awesome. Sheridan is still working out details for its winter party. At DPM, the 6th grade culture fair will be taking place in late February. The 8th grade class has attained their community service goal hours already, but are being asked to continue to log more hours for the remainder of the year. In terms of my presentation, I just provided the board with an update on the key focus areas of the school board, such as our approval of the Lucy Calkins curriculum, the recent approval of the tax levy, and beginning of our teacher contract negotiations. I then gave everyone an overview of the policy committee charter and discussed the role of the policy committee as well as its membership. I did highlight the importance of the policy committee, despite its lack of sexiness, by reiterating that a school board can only govern through its policies and that the development and enforcement of our policies is one of our most important duties. I also touched base on some current and recent policies, as Mike has discussed, regarding social media, curriculum approval, and what the press policies are all about. There were, real quickly, a couple of questions that came up that I did want to share with the board to give you an idea of some concerns and issues amongst the parent community. Specifically, there was a concern regarding curriculum at DPM and whether or not several of the topics were indeed age appropriate. Specifically, the question came up is it appropriate for 5th graders to be studying about the Holocaust in language arts or the bubonic plague in social studies? And how do parents ensure that their children aren't exposed to subjects, concepts, or materials that they may not be ready to handle? As it relates to policy, I did indicate and I did show the board how some of our curriculum is mandated by school code and state law, and then reiterated along with Mrs. Whipple, who was in attendance, that many of these questions need to be directed to your appropriate principal and teacher. Another question that came up, and this is Alan and Jen for you, this question came up about the recently eliminated SSAs. This was from a Middle Fork resident, and I was concerned about a general lack of understanding in the community as to what was going on with this particular issue. I know it's been painted that the district was out to, it was a bit unfair, and that the homeowners in the affected SSAs were not being treated fairly by the SSA, and that the district was somehow responsible for this. Folks don't realize or appreciate the history behind this thing, and I think it represents an opportunity for us to make sure that we're properly educating people through more broad communication opportunities as to why these SSAs were in place in the first place and what eliminating them does to the district. So just as an FYI, that came up. I thought that was interesting. The next board meeting is on Wednesday, the 12th of February, I believe, and thus endeth my report. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
One moment.
Mr. Falker.
Thank you very much for attending.
Oh.
And who is attending in February? Is that, I think it's you too. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Falker and Mrs. Fisher. We now come to action items, of which we have quite a few. The first is approval of the ELA, which stands for English Language Curriculum Adoption. Mr. Simic?
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. The board received a report on the English language arts adoption last month from Mrs. Fagel, and I recommend approving this as presented.
Discussion from board members? If not, could I have a motion that Lake Forest School District 67 approve the English Language Arts adoption?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Lemke?
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski?
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Mr. Folker?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is approval to waive the first reading of Press Issue 87 policy updates. Mr. Borkowski?
So we're going to end up having 6 votes in the next 3 or 4 minutes. I'm just going to talk about all of them briefly at one time. The Policy Committee reviewed a number of policies covered under Press Batches 86, 87, and a 5-year review update from Press. These items covered a large variety of topics, including, but not limited to, educational support staff, board member oath and conduct, vandalism, suspension procedures, debt recovery, facility management, leaves of absence, and so on. The committee, with advisement from the administration team, recommends the approval of all of these policy updates. In the case of Press updates, we are permitted to waive the first reading and move directly to passing these items tonight. If anyone has any questions on them, I'm happy to discuss them. Otherwise, I would move that Lake Forest School District 67 approves the waiving of the first reading for Press Issue 87.
Thank you for that motion. Could I have a second? Oh, discussion. Excuse me. Oh. First, okay. Could I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Discussion.
So, Mike, why are we waiving it instead of letting it sit around for a month?
We absolutely can, I believe, let it sit around for a month. We're allowed to on the press items, but we do not need, because, yeah, there's 2 times that we can waive the first reading, if it's an emergency type of thing or if it's a statutory press type of thing, and that's what it is. But if we don't want to waive it, we certainly can do a first reading.
Other comments or questions from the board? Hearing none, could I have a roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Borkowski?
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson?
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Mr. Lemke?
Aye.
Mr. Folker?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay, approval of Press Issue 87 policy updates, second reading. May I have a motion to that Lake Forest School District 67 approve Press Issue 87 policy updates on second reading as presented?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Not everyone at once. A roll call vote, please.
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Mr. Lemke?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
Mr. Folker?
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski?
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Approval to waive first reading of Press 5-year updates, first reading. Any more comments? Or okay, may I have a motion that's Lake Forest School District 67 approve the waiving of the Press 5-year updates, first reading?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
A roll call vote, please.
Mr. Borkowski?
Aye.
Mr. Lemke?
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Mr. Folker?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Approval of Press 5-year updates, second reading. May I have a motion to approve the second reading?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Roll call vote, please.
Oh, sorry.
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson?
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski?
Aye.
Mr. Lemke?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Approval to waive the first reading of Press Issue 86 Policy 5330, first reading. May I have a motion to waive the first reading of this policy?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Folker?
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson?
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Mr. Lemke?
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Approval of Press Issue 86, Policy 5330, update, second reading. May I have a motion to approve this policy, second reading?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Roll call vote.
Mrs. Clemenson?
Aye.
Mr. Lemke?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
Mr. Folker?
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski?
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay. Next item on the agenda is approval of human resources items. Any comments? Oh, okay. May I have a motion that Lake Forest School District 67 approve the human resources items as presented?
So moved?
A second?
Second.
Any discussion? Hearing none, may I have a roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk?
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Mr. Lemke?
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski?
Aye.
Mr. Folker?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is approval of consent agenda items, which include approval of disbursements, payrolls, and financial statements from December 2014, acceptance of the 2014 audit, minutes of a regular meeting from December 15th, 2014, minutes of an executive session, December 15th, minutes of a board workshop, December 15th, minutes of a tri-district board workshop from January 22nd, 2015, and disposal of audio recordings from June 18th, 2013. Are there any items on the consent agenda which a board member would like removed for further discussion? Hearing none, may I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
May I have a second?
Second.
May I have a roll call vote, please?
Mr. Lemke?
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski?
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Mr. Folker?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Next, FOIA request this month from Janet Martin, Laura Rukavina, Saren Collins, and Laura Rukavina. Announcements. February 11th, 2015 is kindergarten registration. Friday, February 13th is a Tri-District Institute Day, no student attendance. Monday, February 16th is President's Day, no school. Please note that Monday, February 23rd, this is a new date, is the amended Board of Education meeting date and time. Is the time 7 p.m.? 6. Okay, so it's Monday. It's a Monday instead of a Tuesday, and it's at 6 p.m. May I have a motion to adjourn? To adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Well, hold it just a minute. Are we adjourning to executive session, or may I have a motion to adjourn to executive session?
So moved.
May I have a second?
Second.
Roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk.
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Mr. Lemke?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
No, Anderson.
Oh, sorry. Aye.
Mr. Folker?
Aye.
Mr. Borkowski?
Aye.
Mrs. Clemenson?
Aye.
Motion carries. We are in exec session.